December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Oahu. It was the attack that could not happen. American naval experts were certain. The harbor was a fortress, not because of its guns, but because of its geography. 40 feet deep, a death trap for any existing aerial torpedo. Standard models dropped from a plane would plunge far too deep before leveling out, burying themselves harmlessly in the thick mud of the harbor floor. Useless. The intelligence reports were clear on this point. A torpedo attack was an impossibility, but the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy knew something the Americans did not. They carried a secret whispered about for months in the hangars of the carrier Akagi and refined in the closely guarded waters of Kagoshima Bay. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, leader of the First Wave's torpedo squadron, watched the torpedo nets the Americans had failed to deploy and knew they would not have mattered anyway. His weapon was different. His weapon was a ghost, designed to run in the shallows where no torpedo should. The official reports would later describe the impossible. They spoke of the battleship Oklahoma, capsizing in minutes, ripped open by as many as 9 torpedoes. 9 impossible strikes. The West Virginia sinking at its mooring, the California settling into the mud. How did they do it? How did their torpedoes, the dreaded Type 91, run true in waters that should have choked any other underwater weapon? Even the Japanese pilots, men who had practiced the attack relentlessly, were left awestruck by its terrible, flawless efficiency. Rumors circulated in the stunned aftermath. Rumors of a breakthrough, rumors of a modification so simple yet so revolutionary, it had redrawn the laws of naval warfare in a single morning. This is not the story of a new explosive or a complex guidance system. The answer was not hidden in a secret schematic, but in plain sight. It was a secret made of wood. This is the story of the Type 91 Kai-Ni torpedo, and how a pair of simple wooden fins, an attachment born of desperation and genius, became the key to one of history's most devastating surprise attacks. May 5th, 1941. Kagoshima Bay, Japan. The enemy was a number. 45. It was an obsession inside the guarded walls of the Kure Naval Arsenal, a ghost that haunted the dreams of Japan's best naval engineers. 45 feet, the average depth of the American naval anchorage at Pearl Harbor. A paltry, insulting depth. A sanctuary. The Americans believed it was a sanctuary. Their own experts had written the reports, published them. A successful aerial torpedo attack in waters that shallow was impossible. Utterly impossible. But the facts were there. The facts are always stubborn. A standard Type 91 aerial torpedo, released from a Nakajima B-Ven bomber at 200 knots, plunged. It always plunged. It needed depth to recover, to stabilize, to arm. It needed 100 feet of clear water, sometimes more. 100 feet to correct its violent entry and begin its deadly, horizontal run. Pearl Harbor did not have 100 feet. It had 45. 45 feet of water, and then a soft, unforgiving bed of mud and coral. The tests were a disaster. A litany of failure. Commander Katsuhiro Tanaka watched them all. A man of 42 with the tired eyes of someone who solved problems others could not even name. He stood on the bluffs overlooking Kagoshima Bay, a location chosen for its uncanny resemblance to the American harbor. He saw the B-5Ns bank in low, their engines a familiar growl against the sea wind. He saw the black fish drop, and he saw the result, always the same result, a colossal splash, a disappearance, and then seconds later a geyser of mud and black water erupting hundreds of yards short of the target barges. A bottom strike, another failure. The reports went to Tokyo. They were thin, terse. The folder was codenamed Mokusei, Jupiter. It contained diagrams, velocity calculations, and failure analyses. So many failure analyses, the admirals read them. Men like Yamamoto. Men who saw the grand sweep of the Pacific Ocean not as a barrier but as a chessboard. They did not care about hydrostatic pressures or gyroscopic stabilizers. They cared about results. And there were no results, only broken torpedoes and muddy water. They tried everything. Lower drop speeds, which made the bombers vulnerable. Slower and slower still. They tried lower altitudes, dropping from just 60 feet above the waves. A height that terrified pilots, a height that promised a watery grave if the plane wavered for a single instant. The torpedoes still plunged too deep, always too deep. The engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagasaki works filed reports. They blamed the weight of the warhead, they blamed the angle of entry, they blamed physics itself. Drag, instability, premature detonation, rudder lock. Whispers started, maybe from the Naval General Staff, maybe from the war colleges. The Americans were right. It could not be done. The battleships would have to be sunk with bombs. High-level bombs, but bombs were inaccurate. They hit decks. They started fires. They did not break a battleship's spine. Only a torpedo striking below the waterline could guarantee a kill. A torpedo was a killer. A bomb was just a vandal. And then the main thing started. In a smoke-filled room, late one night, Tanaka drew on a blackboard. He was not an artist. His lines were crude, hurried. On the left, a cross-section of a harbor. A line for the water's surface, another for the seabed. 45 feet apart. He sketched a conventional torpedo's path. A steep, fatal parabola. An arc of failure that ended in the mud. He stabbed the chalk at the drawing. "Death," he said to the two junior officers with him. Then he wiped it away. He drew the lines again. Surface, seabed, 45 feet. But this time, he drew a different path for the torpedo. A shallow glide. An almost impossibly flat trajectory. The torpedo would enter the water, and instead of diving, it would float. It would plane like a skipping stone, just beneath the surface. It would run straight and true at a depth of 15, maybe 20 feet. A line of victory. The junior officers were silent. It was a fantasy, a child's drawing. "How, Commander?" One of them, a young lieutenant named Okajima, finally asked. "It defies the laws of motion." The idea came from a rumor, a half-forgotten intelligence report about the British. Their attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto, a shallow harbor much like Pearl Harbor. They had succeeded. How? The details were murky, lost in the fog of war. But there was a word, a whisper. Wood? Wood. It sounded like a joke. The most advanced naval weapon in the world, a machine of steel and compressed air and high explosives to be fixed with wood. It was heresy. But Katsuhiro Tanaka was a man of facts, not dogma. Failure was a fact. 45 feet was a fact. He needed a new fact. The solution was a frame. A simple breakaway wooden frame fitted to the torpedo's tail fins. They called it the Kyoban, a stabilizer. When the torpedo was dropped, this wooden lattice would act like the feathers on an arrow, preventing the tail from rising and forcing the nose down. More importantly, it would act as an air brake and a planing surface upon hitting the water. It would absorb the initial shock. It would create lift. It would force the torpedo into that fantastic, shallow glide. Then, after a few moments, the drag of the water would tear the wooden frame away, leaving the torpedo free to run on its own power. Straight and level. The first test of the modified Type 91 was on a Tuesday. The sky was gray, the water was calm. The target barge seemed to mock them from 1,000 yards out. The B-5N came in low, so low. The black shape dropped. It hit the water, and it did not plunge. It did not dive. It did not throw up a column of mud. There was a splash, and then a wake. A thin, white line cutting across the gray water. A perfectly straight line. It held its depth. 12 meters, then 10. It ran straight. It ran true. A cheer went up from the bluff. A small, strangled sound of disbelief. Tanaka did not cheer. He just watched the white line race toward the barge. He watched it until the inevitable thunderous explosion tore a hole in the ship's rusty side. He watched the smoke billow into the gray sky. He had solved the problem of 45 feet. The ghost was gone. The sanctuary was no longer safe. The key to Pearl Harbor was no longer a fantasy on a blackboard. It was a real, functioning piece of steel and wood. And that is when the true fear began. Because the secret of the Kyoban was now the most important secret in the Japanese Empire. The engineers had conquered the water. Now, the pilots had to conquer 7,000 miles of ocean, and the silence had to be absolute. October 23rd, 1940. Kure Naval Arsenal, Hiroshima Prefecture. The answer was wood. Common, cheap, splintering wood. It was an insult. A joke whispered in the machine shops and drafting rooms where men of steel and science forged the Empire's weapons. They were building the most advanced aerial torpedo in the world, a marvel of engineering designed to fly through the air and swim through the sea. And the key to its success was wood. Nobody believed it. But the facts were there. Facts are always truthful. The problem had a name, a number. 45. 45 feet. The ghost that haunted every test run in Kagoshima Bay. The torpedoes were magnificent. In deep water, they were sharks. In shallow water, they were stones. Dropped from an aircraft, a standard torpedo would plunge. Down. 100 feet, sometimes more before its hydrostatic rudder leveled it out. At Pearl Harbor, the water was 45 feet deep. Dropped there, the torpedo would simply bury itself in the mud. A useless, expensive dart stuck in the bottom of the sea. The Americans knew this. They slept soundly because of it. Their ghost was our ghost. 45? The order came from the highest levels. Fix it, no excuses. The engineers at the Mitsubishi plant in Nagasaki worked on it. The specialists at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal worked on it. Failure after failure. The test reports piled up. Dive angle excessive. Impact with channel floor. Rudder mechanism unresponsive. The mud at the bottom of the bay was filled with their failures. Millions of yen worth of precisely machined steel, propellers, and gyroscopes. All stuck in the mud. The breakthrough came not from a senior engineer, not from a revered commander, but from a whisper. A suggestion from a 22-year-old junior designer, Isoroku Tanaka. He had watched the test pilots. He had seen their frustration. He had also watched children flying kites at the shore. He saw how a simple tale of cloth and sticks could tame the wildest dive. His superiors scoffed. Tanaka, Watanabe, Ito, Kobayashi, the old guard. They saw only steel. They saw only power. Wood? They had sneered. Do you want us to build a fishing spear or a weapon of the Imperial Navy? But one man listened. Commander Shigeharu Orita, a man known for his cold logic. He saw past the material. He saw the physics. The idea was madness, and it was genius. A simple box frame of Katsura plywood, a wooden corset to be fitted over the torpedo's existing metal tail fins. It looked crude, an appendage, something tacked on as an afterthought. Its purpose was twofold. First, buoyancy. The wooden frame was light, almost buoyant itself, and it trapped a pocket of air upon entering the water, fighting the torpedo's natural tendency to sink like a stone. It softened the blow. It cushioned the violent transition from air to water. Second, stability. The flat, broad surfaces of the wooden fins acted like the fletching of an arrow in the air, but here they worked in the dense medium of water. As the torpedo slammed into the sea, the wooden box prevented it from rolling. It stopped the pitch. It killed the yaw. It held the torpedo steady for that first critical second, forcing it into a shallow, controlled entry. A perfect entry. The folder was called Kyukyoku no Heiki, the ultimate weapon. Inside, test report number 84 described the first trial. The Kate bomber roared low over the water. The dark shape dropped. It hit the surface with a splash far less violent than before. And then it ran. Straight and true. just 10 feet below the waves. The observers on the boat held their breath. They waited for the inevitable dive, the sickening lurch towards the seabed. It never came. The torpedo ran on, and on, until it detonated against the target barge 1,000 yards away. There was silence. Then a single shout from the observation tower. The Ghost was wounded. The final piece of the wooden puzzle was its disposability. How to remove the clumsy wooden frame once its job was done? The solution was brutal and simple. The fins were designed to break. They were attached with small, precisely weakened pins, strong enough to survive the drop from the plane and the water entry. But the moment the torpedo struck the hard steel hull of a battleship, the wooden structure would shatter. It would splinter into 1,000 pieces of driftwood. It would simply vanish. No trace left behind. No evidence for the enemy to study. Nothing but a gaping hole in the side of their ship. But the wooden fins only solved the entry, the first second. What about the next 60 seconds? The long run to the target? A shallow harbor floor is not flat. It has ridges, it has valleys. A torpedo running at a fixed depth of 10 feet would still risk grounding itself. The old control systems, a simple pendulum and a hydrostatic valve, were too slow, too clumsy. The torpedo would porpoise. Up, down, up, down. It was a dance of death with the seabed. And so the main thing started. The second innovation was invisible. It was hidden deep inside the torpedo's gut, a spinning heart of brass and steel. Post-war analysts would give it a long, technical name, the Angular Acceleration Control System. The Japanese engineers who built it, working 16-hour days fueled by green tea and patriotism, called it the ante-sochi. The stabilizer. It was more than a gyroscope. A standard gyroscope could tell if the torpedo was pointing up or down. It measured the angle. The ante-sochi was different. It measured the change in the angle, the acceleration. It could feel the torpedo's nose beginning to dip before it actually dipped. It could sense the intention to dive. This new device was a marvel of miniature mechanics. A pair of air-driven gyroscopes, one for roll and one for pitch, connected not to the rudders directly, but to a series of delicate air valves. If the torpedo's nose started to pitch down, even by a fraction of a degree, the gyroscope would sense that angular motion. It wouldn't wait for a new, incorrect depth to be reached. It would react instantly. A tiny puff of compressed air would be sent to the rudder controls, applying an immediate and opposite correction. A nudge. A whisper. Not a command. The result was a torpedo that seemed alive. It didn't swim. It glided. It maintained a perfectly horizontal angle of attack, regardless of the small changes in its actual depth. It skimmed over the unseen terrain of the harbor floor like a low-flying bird, following the contours of the land. This single system made it possible to deploy the torpedo from faster aircraft, the new Nakajima B-5Ns, and from lower altitudes. Pilots no longer needed to maintain a precarious flight path. The aircraft could be traveling at 180 knots, just 60 feet above the waves. Point. Drop. The torpedo would do the rest. It would correct its own violent entry. It would stabilize its own run. It would find its own way. Wood and a thinking gyroscope. These were the secrets. The wooden fins for the plunge, the stabilizer for the run. Together they created the Type 19 torpedo. A weapon capable of striking in waters no one thought possible. A weapon to kill a ghost. The engineers in Kure had finished their work. They had forged a key designed for a very specific lock, half a world away. And the lock was called Pearl. November 26, 1941. The flagship Akagi, North Pacific. It was not about the fish. Not really. It was about the flock. The fish was the Type 19, the shallow water killer, the ghost with wooden fins. But a single predator, no matter how deadly, could be fought. It could be dodged. It could be targeted. A school, however, a coordinated swarm, was something else entirely. It was a force of nature. Commander Minoru Genda understood this. He was a strategist, a thinker. He did not see airplanes and torpedoes. He saw vectors, timetables, and probabilities. On the great plotting board in the Akagi's briefing room, the plan was not a map. It was a piece of music, a score for an orchestra of destruction. The folder was thin. It had a single character on it. Two. Two. The first syllable of Torai, torpedo. But it meant so much more. The first note would be struck by the dive bombers, the Aichi D-3A Val. They would come from the sun, screaming. Their targets were the flight decks of the carriers, if they were there, and the anti-aircraft batteries on Ford Island. Their job was chaos. Their job was to make the American sailors look up, to point their guns at the sky. A distraction, a fatal, fiery distraction. Smoke and fire, fire and smoke. And while the eyes of the fortress were turned upward, the real killers would arrive. Low, so very low. Lieutenant Commander Murata Shigeharu's torpedo squadron, the Nakajima B-5N Kate. They were the heart of the plan. The reason the wooden fins existed, the reason for the endless practice runs in Kagoshima Bay. They would come in under the smoke, skimming the waves, almost tasting the salt spray on their canopies. 40 planes. 40 Type 19 torpedoes. A wall of underwater death aimed at the fat bellies of Battleship Row. Arizona, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma. Names on a list. Tonnage on a ledger. Synchronization. That was the word Genda repeated in the hushed briefings. Synchronization. The Vals would begin their dives at precisely 0753. The Kates, led by Mitsuo Fuchida himself, would begin their torpedo runs 60 seconds later. 60 seconds. That was the window. The gap between the skyward glance and the sideways realization of doom. A lifetime. An eternity. But that was not the whole symphony. Not even close. There was a third wave, hidden in the first. Other Kates, not carrying torpedoes. They flew higher, much higher, above the Vals, above the chaos. They carried something more blunt, more brutal. The Type 99 Number 80 Model 5 bomb. It was not a bomb, not really. It was a 16-inch naval artillery shell. A projectile designed to pierce the armored deck of a warship, fitted with fins and a fuse. 800 kilograms of pure armor-piercing malice. The pilots were told to think of it as a spear thrown from heaven. Genda's finger traced the diagram. A diagram showing aerial torpedo drop and synchronized bombing runs on Battleship Row. It showed everything. The dive bombers descend, pulling gun crews' attention vertically. The torpedo bombers approach horizontally, undetected in the mayhem. Then from the stratosphere, the high-level bombers drop their converted shells. A vertical hammer smashing down on the same moment, a horizontal spear strikes from the side. It was a three-dimensional assault, a coordinated killing box. One weapon opens the door. Another weapon walks through it. They whispered about it in the ready rooms. The pilots, the bombardiers, the navigators. They did not have the full picture, the godlike view of Genda or Admiral Nagumo. They had only their small part, their 60-second window, their designated target. Fly this heading, drop at this altitude, release at this airspeed. They were cogs in a machine they could not comprehend. A perfect, terrible machine. Some would carry the Type 99, others the smaller Type 98 general-purpose bomb, for the cruisers, for the destroyers, for the airfield at Hickam. Tanaka, Yamamoto, Sato, Watanabe, Ito, Kato. Men reduced to a function. The plan was perfect, too perfect. It relied on timing practiced to the second. It relied on American confusion. It relied on the sun, the wind, and the cold nerve of 200 young men. It relied on the fish and the flock striking as one. A single organism. A single unified weapon. The practice was over. The theory was complete. The fleet turned east. Now there was only the waiting and the dawn. December 7th, 1941, 10 miles south of Oahu. The real attack was not in the sky, not Quan Bu. The real secret was below. 5 shadows detached from their mothers, 5 steel phantoms loosed into the pre-dawn gloom. They were the Ko-Hyoteki, the Type A midget submarine. This was the Special Naval Attack Unit, the true tip of the spear. The weapon that was supposed to guarantee the destruction. A secret weapon. They were a promise whispered in the highest echelons of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 2 men, 78 feet of steel, 2 torpedoes, a mission of surgical lethality. Creep into the harbor, undetected, unstoppable. Put torpedoes into the soft-bellied American battleships. Cripple the fleet from within. Then, vanish. It was a beautiful plan. A perfect plan. On paper. The I-22, a giant B-1 type submarine, shuddered in the deep. On its deck, HA-23 was ready. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, 24 years old, checked his gauges. His crewman, Petty Officer 2nd Class Kiyoshi Inagaki, waited. The clamps released. A lurch. They were free. Free and blind. The gyro compass, the intricate Heart Japan's finest navigational technology, was spinning uselessly. A child's top. Sakamaki had charts, a magnetic compass, and a periscope. He was navigating a 78-foot steel coffin through a hostile channel by guesswork. The mission had failed before it began, and then it started. 6:53 in the morning. The USS Condor, a minesweeper, spotted a periscope. A small one, too small. It wasn't American. The message was sent. An hour later, the destroyer USS Ward found it. A black shape trailing a larger submarine. A mother and its child. The Ward's captain, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, did not hesitate. He had been in command for 2 days. 2 days. The first shot of the Pacific War was not a bomb. It was a 4-inch shell from the deck of a rusty old destroyer Yancy. Fired at a Ghost. The shell hit the conning tower. The Ghost bled oil and sank. 1 down, 4 to go. The report crackled over the radio to Naval Headquarters. We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area. The message was received. The message was filed. Maybe it was ignored. Maybe it was disbelieved. A submarine? Here? Impossible. Nerves, they said. Young officers seeing things. The real attack, they knew, would come from the sky. But the ghosts were already inside the house. They were just dying there. HA-19, commanded by Lieutenant Junior Grade Masaharu Yokoyama, ran aground. Stuck hard on a reef east of the harbor entrance. A beached whale, helpless, waiting for the tide or a shell. Another, its torpedoes jammed, was discovered by a Catalina flying boat in the shallow waters of Kihei Lagoon, its crew scuttling the vessel. They were found later, 2 bodies, asphyxiated, a failed suicide, then inside the harbor. The destroyer USS Monaghan, responding to the air attack, saw it. A periscope. Right there, next to the seaplane tender Curtis. The Monaghan's captain, Commander William Burford, gave the order. Ram. The destroyer turned, a charging bull, and crushed the midget submarine against the shoal. Depth charges finished the job. It was not a battle, it was an extermination. 2 torpedoes. That was the whole point. The entire reason for the 10 men, the 5 boats, the years of secret development. 2 torpedoes per boat. Did any of them fire? Rumors. Whispers in the after-action reports. One submarine, they said, launched its payload. Maybe at the Curtis, maybe at the Monaghan. The reports were a mess of smoke, fire, and confusion. The official record states the torpedoes missed. One hit a dock, the other gouged a crater out of Ford Island. 5 submarines, 10 men, 10 torpedoes, 0 capital ships hit. 0. Sakamaki's journey ended in failure. Total failure. His compass broken, his sub damaged by a depth charge, he drifted. Fumes from the batteries filled the cramped space. He tried to scuttle the boat. The charge failed to detonate. He and Inagaki swam for shore. Inagaki drowned. Sakamaki washed up on Bellows Field, unconscious. He awoke to an American soldier standing over him. He was a prisoner, the first Japanese prisoner of war. A living disgrace. Not one of them rejoined the fleet. Not a single one. The final tally was a quiet indictment. Buried Esforzo's a mountain of reports on the aerial devastation. 5 boats launched, 5 boats lost. Iwasa, Yokoyama, Furuno, Hiru, all dead. Sasaki, Inagaki, and 2 other crewmen, also dead. 9 men entombed in steel or water. 1 man in a prison camp, contemplating Kai-Chet. The wooden fins on the aerial torpedoes had worked. The cheap, simple, insulting solution had delivered death from the sky. But the secret weapon, the pride of the Corps arsenal, the technological marvel, had achieved nothing. The report, Folder 87A, was clinical. It was brutal. Midget submarine participation in the attack resulted in no appreciable material damage. No appreciable damage. They were meant to be the decisive blow. They became a footnote, a ghost story. December 7, 1941. Battleship Row, Ford Island. The water was 40 feet deep. Everyone knew it. Naval planners, harbor masters, admirals in Washington. 40 feet. Too shallow for an aerial torpedo, an accepted fact. A certainty as solid as the steel hulls of the battleships moored in pairs. They were safe. The fortress was the water itself, a shallow, muddy shield. That shield shattered at 7:55 in the morning. It began not with a roar, but with a ripple. A flash of silver under the calm surface, seen by Seaman Second-Class Marcus Delaney aboard the USS Oklahoma. He thought it was a porpoise, a trick of the light. Then came the shudder. A deep, gut-wrenching vibration that was not an engine, not a drill, not anything familiar. It was the sound of a giant being punched. Hard. The first Type 19 hit the Oklahoma on its port side, below the waterline. The wooden fins had done their job. The special rudder held its course. The 40-foot problem was no problem at all. It was a lie. And the truth was a 24-inch diameter hole vomiting black smoke and seawater into the ship's guts. A second hit, a third, then a fourth and a fifth. All in a line. A perfect, deliberate, impossible line. They struck like a surgeon's scalpel, opening the battleship from frame 71 forward. The ship weighing 35,000 tons began to list. Not slowly, not with the groaning dignity of a dying behemoth. It rolled with the terrifying speed of a capsizing canoe. Men were running on decks that suddenly became walls. Walls that became ceilings. In less than 12 minutes, the mighty Oklahoma was upside down in the harbor mud, its red bottom exposed to the sky like a ghastly wound. 429 men were inside, trapped. 429. A number from a nightmare? Across the water, the USS West Virginia felt the Phantom's kiss. 7 times. The reports were confused. Garbled radio traffic. Men shouting about bombs. But the damage was low. Low and wet. Captain Mervyn S. Bennion on his bridge was torn apart by shrapnel from a bomb hit on the neighboring Tennessee, but his ship was already dying from below. The torpedoes, the Type 19s, had ripped open its port side as if it were made of paper. The ship settled into the mud, its decks awash, its flag still flying. Sunk. Then the California. Moored alone, a fat, solitary target. 2 torpedoes. 2 perfect hits. They tore into her port side, causing massive flooding. The old battleship began to list, slowly, stubbornly. It took 3 days for her to sink into the silt. 3 days of watching a giant die. They were whispers at first. Phantom torpedoes, a secret weapon. Someone said they were launched from submarines. Midget subs that had slipped past the nets. The official damage report, filed in the frantic days after, was a mess of contradictions. It spoke of bombs, of sabotage, of magazine explosions. The folder was codenamed Magic Alpha 7. It tried to explain the inexplicable. How could they have been hit by torpedoes? The water was too shallow. Too shallow. The USS Nevadian at the end of the row took a single torpedo hit in the bow. But it was alive. It fought back. Its guns were the first to open fire, the only battleship to get underway. It was a beacon of hope in the smoke, a lone warrior steaming for the open sea. But it was bleeding, a gaping wound from a Type 19. The Japanese pilots saw it, a wounded animal trying to escape the kill zone. They swarmed it like piranhas, bomb after bomb. To keep it from blocking the channel, it was beached, burning near Hospital Point. One torpedo had started it all. It had marked the ship for death. The fish had done its work. The wooden-finned killers from Kure, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada. A list of ghosts. The tangible proof. Battleship Row was a junkyard of American power, twisted steel and shattered pride lying in 40 feet of water. 40 feet. The shock was absolute. It was a paralysis of command, a failure of imagination made real by fire and water. They said it couldn't be done. The Japanese had not listened. They just built a fish with wooden fins. That was the secret. Simple, elegant, and deadly. The Americans had looked at the water and seen a shield. Japan had looked at the same water and seen a doorway. And in the quiet, echoing silence between the explosions and the screams, the new investigation began. Not with ships, but with numbers. 40 feet, 180 knots, 10 feet of running depth. The numbers didn't add up. They were impossible. But the facts were there. The facts were always there, resting in the mud of Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. Battleship Row, Ford Island. The water was 40 feet deep. Everyone knew it. Naval planners in Washington, harbor masters in Oahu, admirals on their flagships. 40 feet. A fact as solid as the steel hulls of the battleships moored in pairs. Too shallow for an aerial torpedo attack. It was a rule. A law of naval warfare written in textbooks and proven in exercises. Torpedoes dropped from planes would dive, plunging 100 feet or more before stabilizing. In Pearl Harbor, they would simply bury themselves in the mud. Useless. The harbor was safe. A bathtub for giants. But Isoroku Yamamoto was not interested in rules. He was interested in results. He had not asked his engineers if a shallow water torpedo was possible. He had told them to make one. The request was not a technical query. It was an imperial command. The entire plan, the audacious, impossible strike against the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, depended on it. Not the bombs, not the fighters, the torpedoes. They were the ship killers, the true purpose of the Kido Butai's 6,000-mile journey across a hostile ocean. They called him a gambler, a poker player who loved long odds. London, Monte Carlo, Newport. He knew the Western mind. He knew its reliance on logic, on precedent, on rules. And he knew that the greatest weakness of a logical man is the thing he believes to be impossible. The shallow harbor was not a problem. It was the entire point. It was the psychological weak point in the American fortress. Yamamoto did not seek to overcome the challenge of the harbor's depth. He sought to weaponize it. The plan lived in his mind. A portrait of the admiral from that time would show the strain, the focus. Annotations would radiate from his temples. One line to the Mitsubishi Nagasaki Works, where engineers under Captain Toshihide Asakuma worked around the clock. Another to Kagoshima Bay, the carefully chosen topographical twin of Pearl Harbor. A third line to the pilots of the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, all connected to this one central idea. Break the rule. Break the fleet. And so they did. In the workshops of the Kure Naval Arsenal, the answer was found. An insult to high technology. Wood. Simple breakaway wooden fins attached to the tail of a modified Type 91 aerial torpedo. The folder was labeled Project G12. A secret within a secret. The fins would create drag, prevent the deep dive, and then shatter on impact with the water. At the same time, a new gyroscopic stabilizer, small, exquisite, and wickedly fast, would spin to life, righting the weapon in seconds. It was a brute force solution of breathtaking elegance. It was technological ingenuity born from tactical desperation. Seaman First Class James O'Connell, age 19, was on the deck of the USS Oklahoma. He was waiting for the launch to take him to shore. He tasted coffee in the salt air. He saw the planes. They were coming in low over the water, impossibly low. He thought it was a drill, a very realistic drill. Then he saw something fall from the belly of the lead plane, a dark shape. It hit the water with a surprisingly small splash. That was the Type 19, the weapon that could not exist. For a few critical seconds, it was just a piece of falling metal. Then the magic happened. The wooden fins, the ETA, caught the air, then the water. They snapped off as designed. The torpedo, instead of diving into the mud, leveled out. 10 feet, 15 feet. The gyroscope, a frantic, caged beast, screamed at 10,000 revolutions per minute, holding it steady. A thin white wake appeared on the calm harbor surface. A scar on the water. It was running hot, straight, and normal. It was Yamamoto's will, forged into 900 pounds of steel and Shimoda's powder, crossing 40 feet of water. The reports came later. In a debriefing, a captured pilot, Lieutenant Junichi Goto, spoke of the final training. We were told to think of the Admiral, to see the harbor as he saw it, not as water, but as a path. The path had been cleared by the engineers, the anonymous men who toiled over blueprints and failures. Nagano, Abe, Kumagai, Hiroshi. Names that meant nothing in Washington. Names that had just rewritten the laws of naval physics. They had built the key. Now, the pilots were turning it in the lock. O'Connell pointed. Others on the deck of the Oklahoma saw it too. "A fish!" someone shouted. "A porpoise." The joke died in their throats. The white line did not deviate. It did not swerve. It came for them. It was a line drawn from Yamamoto's mind directly to the soft steel belly of their ship. The rule said it was impossible. The torpedo did not know the rule. The fortress was built on a belief. The belief that 40 feet of water was a shield. But for a man like Yamamoto, a shield is just a target you haven't figured out how to pierce yet. The ingenuity was not just in the wooden fins or the gyroscope. It was in the very idea. The idea that technology must serve strategy, not constrain it. The idea that the most formidable defense is the one your enemy believes you cannot breach. The white line reached the hull of the Oklahoma. For a moment, there was nothing. A silent touch. And then the world ended. October 9th, 1945. Newport, Rhode Island. The war was a ghost, a collection of victory parades, mothballed ships, and reports stamped with thick red lines of secrecy. For most, the story of Pearl Harbor was settled, a scar that had begun to heal. The official narrative was clean, concise, and wrong. Terribly wrong. Commander Arthur Jensen, age 42, knew it. He could taste the lie in the stale air of the Naval War College's archives, a metallic tang like old blood. The lie was comfortable. It blamed complacency, a lack of readiness, a brilliant air attack. It was a story America could understand. It was not the truth, not the whole truth. The truth was buried in folders nobody wanted to open. Folders with unassuming titles. Salvage report, USS Oklahoma, Section Gamma. Underwater ordnance debris analysis, Ford Island sector. Jensen had read them all, again and again. The early reports from 1942 were a mess of confusion, a cacophony of panicked voices trying to make sense of the unthinkable. The consensus was swift. Torpedoes from the sky. Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers, flying low and slow. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitnesses, recovered aircraft parts, the very logic of naval warfare. The harbor was only 40 feet deep. Everyone knew that. A torpedo dropped from a plane needed at least 75, maybe 100 feet of water to run true. It was a fact, a law of physics. But facts can be bent. laws can be broken. The first whispers came from the divers, the men who lived in the dark, cold water surrounded by the dead. Men like Chief Petty Officer Frank Malloy, a salvage specialist from Brooklyn, with hands as rough as coral. His team worked on the capsized Oklahoma. In his debriefing, a tired 3-page transcript from February of 42, he mentioned anomalies. Strange pieces of wreckage near the hull breaches. Not steel, not aluminum. Wood. Splintered pieces of what looked like fir or pine, some with strange lattice patterns, others with remnants of metal clasps. The interviewing officer, a young lieutenant from Annapolis, dismissed it. Debris from the docks, he wrote. Flotsam, case closed. It was not flotsam. Jensen spread the photographs across his wide oak desk. Grainy, black and white images of the wooden fragments. They looked like nothing. Trash. But then he laid them next to a diagram. A classified diagram, smuggled out of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal by an intelligence asset in August of 45. The diagram of the Type 19's tail assembly, the wooden fins, the breakaway stabilizers, it was a perfect match. The ghost in the harbor finally had a face made of wood. The success at Pearl Harbor was not a single blinding flash. It was a seed, a virulent idea planted in the mind of the Imperial Japanese Navy. An idea that proven limitations were merely a failure of imagination. They carried the lesson forward, to the Battle of the Coral Sea, where carrier tactics were rewritten in fire. To Leyte Gulf, where the desperation of the kamikaze showed the world that the pilot himself could become the guidance system. The Type 19 was the blueprint. It proved that a determined enemy could weaponize the environment itself, turning a shallow, placid harbor into a perfect killing field. It taught them that American technological superiority was a fortress with an unlocked back door. The door was ingenuity. The folder on Jensen's desk was called Project 47. It was the U.S. Navy's secret post-mortem on the Pearl Harbor torpedoes. It was his life for the past 6 months. Page after page detailed the failure to imagine. The failure to believe an enemy could be so audacious. They had trusted their numbers. 40 feet. They trusted their physics. 75 feet. They had built their defenses around rules the enemy refused to play by. Schneider, Miller, Thompson, a whole committee of ordnance experts had testified before Congress in 42. They swore under oath that a successful torpedo attack in those conditions was impossible. Impossible. And here was the proof of the impossible sitting on Jensen's desk. A single water-warped piece of wood shipped all the way from an evidence locker in Hawaii. It was light in his hand. Insignificant. Yet it had helped sink battleships. It had changed the world. It was the most important lesson of the entire war. The lesson was not about steel or explosives or engines. It was about overcoming a problem with something unexpected, a piece of wood, a simple, elegant, terrifying solution. The legacy of the Type 19 was not in museums. It was in the design rooms at Newport and the testing ranges in the California desert. It forced a generation of American naval architects to think like their enemy, to design for the absurd, to plan for the impossible. Countermeasures for shallow water torpedoes, magnetic anomaly detectors for harbor entrances, new net designs, new patrol doctrines. The list was long. The list was expensive. The list was written in the blood of 2,403 Americans. A high price for a lesson. A very high price. Commander Arthur Jensen picked up the grainy photograph of the recovered fin. He stared at the simple lattice of wood. So clever. So deadly. The real weapon wasn't the 80-pound warhead. It wasn't the compressed air engine. The real weapon was the idea that you could ignore the rules, the idea that a fence is only a fence until someone finds a way to fly over it, or tunnel under it. He leaned back in his chair, the cold October fog pressing against the window pane. The plans for their own shallow water project were on the corner of his desk. They were beautiful, complex, and deadly, codenamed Keyhole. The war was over, but the next one had already begun. What if the most devastating weapon of war is not one that fires, but one that is simply seen, Or perhaps one that is only imagined? The answer lies buried deep, buried like the standard issue torpedoes that plunged uselessly into the thick mud of the harbor floor, a testament to flawed design. Buried like the secrets inside the guarded walls of the Kure Naval Arsenal, where Japan's best engineers chased a ghost of naval physics. The truth was a joke whispered in machine shops, a phantom that haunted drafting rooms, a problem without a solution that became an obsession. It glints like a flash of silver under a calm surface. A momentary vision, a trick of the light seen by Seaman Second Class Marcus Delaney. Was it a weapon? A fish? A piece of debris from a damaged ship? The report was filed. The sighting noted. A single drop of ambiguity in an ocean of chaos. It echoes in the frantic radio chatter from that morning. We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area. A submarine that left no wreckage? A submarine that left no oil slick? A ghost hunted by explosives in the shallow waters, its existence confirmed only by the fear it created. A ghost that was never found, and it hides today. Behind the fading photographs of victory parades, behind the silent hulls of mothballed ships, behind the archives stamped with thick red lines of secrecy. The reports exist, the testimonies were given, but the story they tell is incomplete, a narrative with its heart surgically removed by men who decided what history should remember. Between the lines, between the files, between the silence. History is not what happened, it is what is recorded. War is not won on the battlefield alone. It is won in the narrative that follows, a narrative of heroes and villains, of genius and failure, of secret weapons and fatal flaws. They came as the ship killers, the proud fist of the Kido Butai, after 6,000 miles across a hostile ocean. They came to deliver a decisive blow, the final word in a naval argument. They were the purpose. They were the weapon. They left as something else, as witnesses, as the first believers in a new myth. The Japanese pilots arrived under the smoke, skimming the waves, almost tasting the salt spray. They expected a fleet. They expected resistance. They expected a fight they had trained their entire lives for. They did not expect the impossible. They did not expect a weapon that defied the very laws of physics that had tormented their own engineers. A torpedo that could run true in the shallows where their own could not. The flash of silver was not just a sighting, it was a confirmation of their deepest technological fears. The ghost from the Kure Arsenal had followed them across the Pacific. It was real, and it was American. They were left speechless, not by the fire, not by the explosions, but by a flash of silver. By the specter of a perfect weapon they were preconditioned to believe in. A weapon whose true power was not in its warhead, but in its legend. Perhaps the greatest secret of December 7th, 1941, was not a piece of technology hidden in an American laboratory. Perhaps it was a story, a powerful, terrifying story that the Japanese pilots told themselves in the seconds between spotting their target and releasing their ordnance. The U.S. Navy's secret weapon was not made of steel. It was made of doubt. It was forged in the anxieties of their enemy. Some secrets die with those who kept them. Others live forever, changing shape with every telling. In the end, the most powerful ghosts are the ones we bring with us. And some ghosts refuse to die.